Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Hi, everyone. So about me, not going to bore you with that bit, but go Cubs. Anyone in here a Cubs fan? Come on. Woo! Sports ball. All right. So I work for a company called Slack. Who here doesn't know what Slack is? Okay, so it's we sell men's pants online is what Slack does. No, we all know it's just WebIRC. So I'll just move on here. There's some additional information at the end of this talk. It's in the form of a GitHub gist. Don't bother trying to write down notes or links. I didn't put any in here. They're all in the gist at the end to save you some time. Did anyone here, I wrote a blog post back in March of this year called Distributed Security Alerting. Did anyone happen to see that? So cool. So this talk has some bits from that. It expands on it a bit, but you should take a look at it when you have some time. It's a really quick read, and it just talks about how we implemented some of this stuff. One other thing is next week at O'Reilly Amsterdam, we're going to be releasing some of the tools I'm talking about finally. So I've been promising this for about 6 months, and now it's actually finally happening because there's a deadline. So look for that next week. I want to start the talk by doing a little discussion about breaches. How does the company know when it's been hacked? This is rhetorical. There are a few ways, and I'm going to order these from what I think is sort of best case to worst case. So best case to me is the company's employees notice something strange. This is best case because it means that maybe your tooling worked and caught something, but regardless of how you noticed, the best thing about this is you control the messaging. You don't have to worry about rushing to notify that kind of thing. Well, you do in some cases, but you basically have a lot of advantages here that you don't have if a third party contacts the company because they notice something strange. Who here knows Krebs, or of Krebs? Yeah. So hearing from Brian Krebs, and he's an amazingly nice person, but hearing from Brian Krebs is not something most people want. They don't want an email or a call from Brian. And so a third party noticing something strange isn't great because it means that the effects of the breach have probably extended beyond a small group or your company. This is worse. So hackers contact the company because they want them to notice something strange. I mean, if you're in this state, that means they've done whatever the heck they want to do, and now they're showing off. Don't be in this state. But guess what? There's one that's worse. They don't. So I don't want to be a security nihilist, but we probably all realize that there are a number of companies out there that have ongoing breaches and probably have no idea this is happening. And it's just kind of the landscape we deal with these days. But this to me is the worst case because it means the hackers could notify you anytime. Like there are a lot of things, but it just means that you have absolutely no control over this. You also have no chance to remediate anything here because you don't even know what's happening. The important factor here is time, and by the way, I gave this talk recently. That's the clock in front of Big Ben. I was wrong. Big Ben is not the tower or the clock; it's the bell. So, fun fact: I got that wrong last time. Somebody from the UK corrected me, and now I didn't mention their name. I'm sorry. So, how did they get in? This is also important. How many people here think it's super hackers? Are super hackers breaking into things? Not even one person? Yes, sir. I disagree. So it's not super hackers. It's not the guy with the laptop and the balaclava and everything sitting at his keyboard. It's usually much simpler than that. This is a contentious report that comes out every year, but one thing it seems to say every year is that most of these breaches are due to very simple things like credential theft. If you're an attacker, it's a lot easier to steal someone's password than to write a zero-day exploit for Chrome. So just a fact of how things work, and this is what leads to a lot of this stuff. So this is an amazing vector graphic, and the NSA's graphics department did an amazing job because every time I show this slide, I'm impressed how good it looks. And great PR on their part. The reason it's on here, did anyone see the talk from the head of tailored access operations at Enigma or see the video of it? Cool. So not a lot of people that I've spoken to have seen this talk, and I highly recommend checking it out. It's in the notes at the end, and I think it's 20 or 30 minutes. Really good talk. But what it points out is that the NSA doesn't use zero-day to break into your systems. They study your network. They understand it better than you do. They wait for you to do something wrong, like, hey, a vendor needs access to this temporarily, so we'll just open it real quick. And they just look for that, and then when you've opened it, oh, hey, thanks, we're in. This isn't to say that the NSA should be in your threat model. It actually really shouldn't. But it's that easy for them to break in, and it's that easy for a lot of adversaries to do this exact same thing. So watch that talk because it's practical beyond just protecting you from the NSA. The rest of the talk is sort of one example of what we do for security monitoring. This is a rough breakdown of what we're going to go through, and there should be plenty of time for QA at the end. Part 0, getting started. So I was the first security employee at Slack back in October of 2014. There were 50 people there, and it was small. And one of the nice things about this was it was very greenfield. The group that created Slack is actually the folks that created Flickr and some other stuff. So they had dealt with web vulnerabilities. They actually had a pretty good grasp on don't access, use CSRF crumbs, all this stuff, right? They were doing a lot of things really well. And that was part of what I really liked about it. The other thing here is that with Greenfield, you don't have to deal with legacy systems, and that's great. You can just start fresh and implement a lot of the stuff you've always wanted to do, maybe at previous jobs. So one of the goals I had when I started out, again, one security employee. We already had a decent number of people using Slack at that point, but I didn't want to create a dashboard. So I wanted the ability to watch a lot of different things, but I didn't want a dashboard that you burn through all the time. I won't say I hate SIMs. Next slide. So this is, I lied a little bit. We do have a dashboard, but this is what it generally looks like. And it's almost, on the weekends, it's almost always empty. And during the weekday, it's relatively empty. And the idea here is that when something happens and is important enough to go up here, somebody looks at it, remediates it. But the issue is, don't be netcool. All right, so how many people have heard of netcool? I'll be surprised. Oh, hello. Do you work for the company that makes netcool? Okay, thanks. Okay. So one of my first jobs was, because I just would say be netcool. So one of the first places I worked was orbits.com, and that was back in 2001. We had this thing, netcool. And it was it wasn't security at all. It was just monitoring for all of our infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. What you do is on hosts or in software, you'd send alerts to it, and they'd go onto a dashboard. And it's great because you have all the operators looking at the dashboard until it's not great because there's 30,000 alerts on the dashboard and nobody's paying attention to any of them. Well, people are paying attention to the reds, which are criticals. And that just means that now if I'm writing a new alert, I'm going to make it a critical so it goes to the top. Yeah, it just leads to apathy, and nobody's actually monitoring anything. And this really kind of shaped how I think about monitoring. If you're super noisy, nobody is ever going to pay attention. So don't be netcool, or don't be, sorry, I should amend this. Don't be our implementation of netcool. I'm sure you can use it to do great things. This is our data center. This is our other data center. So when Slack was set up, it was set up on an AWS account, right? We're hosted in AWS. And when I started doing some of this stuff, I wanted my own AWS account. Beyond mining Bitcoin, this is great because you're not dependent on anything in production infrastructure to do your job. It also means that you can give a limited number of people access to this environment, right? So the SecOps environment is, I want to say today there are 5 people that have credentials that can access this environment. And what that really helps with, we're not trying to be, super secret squirrel about a lot of this stuff, but if you give every engineer access to the same environment where you're monitoring for security things, that's not great. The other thing you can do is there are a lot of permissions I don't have in prod, so you don't have the situation where the watcher is watching himself, right? And that's also a nice advantage. We actually run some critical path software there too. So we use some things that production depends on, and that means we actually have a strong operational team within security that does a lot of this work. So how do we collect the data from our hosts? The first step in this should be to set up a reliable logging pipeline. How many of you have written logs to var log, and not right now, maybe your boss is here, but how many of you have written logs to var log and just never looked at them? Okay, a lot of liars in the room, that's fine. So having a reliable logging pipeline is important, especially when you have sort of infrastructure at scale, right? You should be shipping those logs somewhere, and a lot of times they just sit on a host and whatever. The other part about this is, the reliable bit is important. Syslog's great, and it sends UDP messages, and they might get there, but there are actually other ways you can do this. So we use our syslog with something called RELP, which stands for Reliable ELP. I actually, sorry, that's almost a canned joke at this point, but I still forget to look up what it stands for every single time. The reliable is the important bit, and what this does is it's a TCP connection to the far side syslog receiver, and it ensures delivery. If it gets cut off, it spools to disk temporarily and then sends them. And the way we actually handle this is we accept via our syslog on the host, we accept all the messages locally. We don't actually write them to disk unless we have to spool them. They just get sent off host immediately. I also think that's a relatively useful property. And then what do we do with them? So that SecOps cloud I was talking about, there's one major gate, their VPC period, if you know what Amazon does with VPC. And there's basically one inlet to SecOps from production, which is RELP, right? So we expose a port that all of these hosts in production can connect to directly. And every single one, we're about 5,000 instances now in AWS. Every single one of them has their own stream directly across into our RELP receiver on the other side. And what we use for that is something called StreamStash, which was written by Nate, who's one of my colleagues. He actually wrote it for his previous employer because they were also collecting massive volumes of logs. And it's performant, it's easy to set up, and it does everything we need. So you can also use Logstash for this. I don't want to be too mean about Logstash, but we didn't get close to the performance we wanted out of Logstash. We had to run a lot more instances. That could be, because Nate's an expert in his own thing and whatever, but I think Logstash was a bit heavy for what we were trying to do. So check out StreamStash. It's on GitHub. It's free. Everything on here will eventually be on GitHub. This is just a fun little graph. The details aren't super important. The bottom right there is RELP connections. And so that's what it looks like, right? You have all these TCP connections that are just always open to the RELP receivers on the other side. We actually do quite a bit more monitoring than this. This was back in March. And as you can see, back in March, we had 2,700 and some odd servers, each one with a connection to this environment. And we monitor for things like the processing rate, the filter times, all of that, and can alert if there's something like a potential local DOS. Like if you fork bomb a box, right, you might make those climbs. So we look for stuff like that. And then all of this goes into Elasticsearch. How many people here use Elasticsearch? Cool. We do too. So Elasticsearch is great. It's scaled well for us. There was a bit of a learning curve to get Elasticsearch up and running and reliable. Once you get there, it's a pretty handy tool. But what data do we send to this thing? So this is sort of my favorite part. How many people here use auditd? Yes, okay, new friends. So a lot of people don't. And what's great about auditd is you already have it, right? Almost certainly. It's very old. It's been around since kernel 2.6. You almost already have it. It's right next to SE Linux, AppArmor, and all that other shit you've turned off on your host. It is right there, ready to use. But it's a bit complicated. So this isn't too bad. This is auditctl, and this is a bit that you use to insert rules for syscalls you want to watch. So you're telling the kernel, I want to know about every 64-bit execution. So this is every time a new 64-bit process is spawned, or every 32-bit process is spawned. Or this last one's not useful, but it's okay, I want to know every time the CPU info file is written to appended or accessed, and oh, sorry, read and appended, I think. And so you can set these up. It's pretty handy. And some people do this for like sort of sysdig style looking at like what's happening with a network connection. Like you can't catch it quickly enough in netstat, so you set one of these up and look for it. But just, you know, it's a little bit cumbersome to set up. And then this is what you get. Let me clean that up a little bit. That's out of D message. So this is what you get. Gold star for the first person that can tell me how many events are on that listing. Like how many unique events does that represent? Somebody yell a number.
12, 2, 4, 3.
3. So this log format is not my favorite. I'm going to try the mouse cursor. Oh yeah, look at that. So see this thing here, the 650733? That tells you that it is associated with this one that says it and this one that says it, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this is super fun to parse because it's second item inside the print after the colon. And technically, like, this timestamp is also the same across them, so like it's technically the whole thing. But this is actually an identifier that the kernel tracks, and I don't know when the timestamp's associated. So this is what we care about. The point here is like we could take this data and try to make use of it, but it's pretty hard. So we don't. We went another route. And the first thing we did was we thought, hey, this data is pretty useful. So there's something called AUDISP, which the user space part of auditd has this capability called AUDISP. And you can write a plugin in basically any language that can accept standard in, and then it gets exactly this data and can do whatever you want with it, right? So you write it in whatever. We just wrote a quick sort of hacky version in Python as a POC, and it worked, right? And what we did was transformed it into JSON because we're not savages. And that was pretty good. But there were some limitations, and what we realized was, sorry I'm jumping around in slides, but what we realized was this message actually comes pretty much as is from the kernel. So auditd isn't doing a lot, right? It's just basically the facility to write this to a file or do something with it. And so what we did was wrote a replacement for it. It's called Go Audit. I'm not going to do the joke. It's written in Go. Everyone gets it. So Go Audit's pretty handy, and what it allows you to do is connect straight to the kernel's netlink socket where it's sending these audit messages, and it does all the conversion to JSON, and then you can send it out to the your log facility or whatever you want to do. So it's not doing anything super magic. It's just taking these events, adding a little context as well, like resolving UID to username and some stuff like that, and then making a single JSON blob that can be forwarded on. This is me running a super sketchy command called uptime, and this is just a demo. I was nervous about like giving away host names, so I changed my prompt to $, classic. And this is me running uptime on a box. This is just showing it in Kibana. It worked. You should also grab stuff like auth logs. A lot of people aren't looking at SSH logs. If you do SSH logging, just as a side note, you should turn on key fingerprinting so you know which keys are actually being used to SSH in, not just that somebody logged in with some key. It's pretty handy for monitoring. If you use AWS or cloud services, you should use CloudTrail or whatever their equivalent is. One question I often get is, why don't we use OSQuery or Sysdig, right? Like, these are both pretty cool projects. I like OSQuery a lot. I like Sysdig a lot. One major difference here is that OSQuery is more about point-in-time snapshots, right? So, like, if I happen to do something between OSQuery polling times, then there's a chance that it's never noticed, right? And I think that's absolutely fine for things like laptops that people close, they go offline, whatever. Like, you have to do best effort. You can't have a stream of data from all of your employee laptops being sent somewhere constantly and expect that that's going to be perfectly reliable. But in our case, all of these hosts are in Amazon, and if we're doing our jobs well, they should be available 24/7. So I think streaming this data off constantly is the approach we favor. And it's because we don't do any of the filtering locally. We just do sort of a fire hose. And it's actually not that bad. It surprised me, but it's only, I mean, it's under a megabit per host worth of data that's constantly streaming out. But this data is all being collected somewhere else, and we can actually go back in time and like apply rules to it, test it, all kinds of stuff. And we have tons of data stored about what our hosts are doing. Sysdig is also really cool. It's a great tool, but the model they've gone with Falco is to like do the rules and the alerting on each individual host, and it's just we went a different way. Web logs are super important here as well. I think that's probably the biggest volume of logs we have. And you know, it's really important to also correlate those with activity you see in other places, right? Adversaries aren't just trying to SSH into your servers, right? They're poking it at lots of things. So lots of logs. Looks like a very 70s picture of logs. So let's talk about detection. One of my favorite things, the defender's advantage. A lot of people, you know, sort of think, okay, attackers have all the advantages. Defenders actually have an advantage if the attacker doesn't know what you're looking for. This is the idea behind honeypots and a lot of things, but if the attacker doesn't know what to avoid, they're going to trip over an alarm. The problem is a lot of these rule sets, a lot of things that you can learn about a company are just off the shelf, right? One of the easiest to explain examples is virus total. So if I write a bit of malware and I want to make sure that that malware works on every PC out there, I just keep modifying it until I pass all the checks on virus total. I release it to the world, and hooray, 100%. You know, I've got everyone, at least temporarily. But if you actually don't use off-the-shelf rule sets and you actually understand your environment and write them, you can have an advantage there because the attacker doesn't know what to avoid. Another useful point is that 0 days are not invisibility cloaks. In the context of an individual laptop or host, sure, maybe. Like you might have something that pops in, you know, does something cool and turns off all telemetry. In a networked environment with 5,000 hosts, it's really hard to do that across all 5,000. You still have a chance to observe interesting activity. So don't assume that you've lost if there's even a 0 day or a known vulnerability in system software you're running. They're not invisibility cloaks. Once you're in, you still have to do something, right? Unless your goal is just to prove that you can break into 5,000 servers and do nothing. I guess maybe someone's done that. One of my favorite cases to target here is the hypothetical malicious insider. The reason for that is the hardest thing to defend against is somebody who both understands your environment and has credentials to access your environment. Like it really doesn't get much worse than that. We actually joked once that our greatest risk, security-wise, was a disgruntled security employee, which is probably true. It's actually not entirely true though, because we split duties between security and ops, and we don't have access to everything they do. Mission control is pretty cool. Never going to remember why this slide is in there. Whatever. So Elasticsearch or Splunk are what you want to use. How many people here use Splunk? Cool. They're buying drinks at the end of the day because they have all the money. So one reason we use Elasticsearch, and I was just talking with Josh about this, who was nice enough to, by the way, lend me his laptop because I'm an idiot. So we use Elasticsearch because we don't want to limit what data we're collecting based on the volume of data, right? If there's something we want to collect, we want to just say, hey, cool, let's send all of it. And our logs are extremely variable. Like our Elasticsearch indexes are maybe 100 gig on the weekend and 500 gig on a weekday, right? Like when operators are in. We don't want to just say like, oh, well, maybe let's not collect that thing. It could be important. We just want to collect everything we can. And so I really like the model of Elasticsearch where we just spin up more instances and the cost is however many instances we run, but we're not bound by a license cost there. ElastAlert's another tool we use. So if you use Elasticsearch, I recommend at least checking this out. It's from Yelp, and what it basically does is stored queries against Elasticsearch. So if you think of like a Kibana query, you take that, you paste it into an ElastAlert rule, and then every hit on that, or standard deviation, or spike, or flatline, you can just send an alert. It's really handy. So it's a good way. And so we just have this loop of like these alerts running these queries running constantly. When they see the thing that they're looking for, they alert. And that loop, you know, is generally under 10 seconds, right? Like we have a bunch of queries and they run and then they run again. It's not as good as streaming stuff, or it is. It doesn't really matter, right? Like we don't have to do it the moment something bad happens. I think within 10 seconds is pretty acceptable. Let's talk about rules. So commands that people run, like uptime. That's a good one. We actually don't watch for the uptime command. So if you hack us, we have uptime, fair play, you did it. But we do look for a lot of commands. And what I'm not going to tell you is which commands we look for, because that would be absolutely silly. But we look for a lot of different stuff. We look for a lot of different combinations. And the point is, if you land on a host, you're going to do a lot of discovery and try and figure out what the heck this thing does and what I can get to and what I'm supposed to do. So you don't want to tell people what you're looking for, because there are a lot of ways, especially in Unix, to sidestep that, right? But there's a good chance you're going to run across one of the things that we think is rather interesting. We also monitor files and file modification in a lot of places. And one side note on files, this is like a very important detail about auditd. The way file watches, I showed you one earlier where I was watching CPU info. The way they're implemented in the kernel is actually, it's a hash table if you enumerate individual files, but you can also do directory watches, and those are not a hash table. So they're actually less efficient. So in some cases, if you want to watch a ton of files, it's actually better to enumerate 1,000 files you want to watch and shove 1,000 rules in there than it is to watch a directory, in some cases, but your mileage may vary. Sockets are also important. So the connect syscall on a Linux box happens a lot, like a lot. And it's also super useful. One of the things that you can do is via GoAudit, you can monitor every connect event. And the reason I really like this is because you can also glean more information than if you're doing passive network monitoring. So if you have an IDS in mind, cool. IDSs have uses. But what they can't tell you is the PID that actually launched the process, or the process name, or whatever on host, right? So having this data is super useful. It's sort of network monitoring that's on host, but you get a ton of cool stuff. One other thing that can be useful to look at just in aggregate across your system is the time people are awake. Unless you have a very interesting case, most people are not awake 24 hours a day. So like noticing when, like if something is happening a lot and shouldn't be, it's pretty useful. GeoIP, meh, like it's okay. It can be useful. I think the case of like this person hopped from this place to this place, not super useful because GeoIP is not perfect, but it can be useful. And if you see a hop to a place that you really don't expect, that's fine. But IP is actually really interesting. So another question for the audience. I collected every IP I connected to Slack or any of our backend services from. So every IP I connected from over the course of a year. Within a range of, just give me a number and within 50s, right? How many IPs did I use over a year? And I travel a fair amount. Like, you know, somebody yell out a number.
350.
No.
10,000.
10,000, way lower, way lower.
1,200.
108 IPs. So, yeah, so come on down. So 108 IPs is not a lot of IPs. One thing to think about when you're doing this stuff too is that you have a lot of data here that's super useful. You can actually tailor IDSs to individuals as well. So I know which 108 I came from, and I don't have to label those as good, bad, whatever, but I can also just ask someone if they came from a new IP, and then I can add it to my list of IPs that they might come from. And you probably want to expire those over time. But this is a really useful capability, personalizing IDSs. So what do we do with the alerts? We wrote a thing called Alert Center. It won't be open source next week, unfortunately, but we're hoping to do that at some point. All it really is something that manages the alert lifecycle. So once a last alert says, hey, this bad thing happened that you have a rule for, goes into Alert Center, and it's MySQL database. It just says, this is the alert, and it tracks like whether it's been resolved, blah, blah, blah. So it's the thing you have to do with the alerts to make sure they've been resolved. Also really handy for auditors, right? So you want to prove that you're doing stuff with the alerts you get. This is where we do it. And then we use this thing called SecurityBot that I wrote. And SecurityBot is just something that queries Alert Center and says, hey, which alerts are new and alerts that someone hasn't been notified on? Okay, cool. I'm going to notify them, and then sets in Alert Center that it has notified them and manages the alert lifecycle. And this is how we use it. And this is the bit that, like, if you're bored right now, look up for 1 minute, I promise. And this is like the kind of neat thing. So what we do is we say SecurityBot sends them a message and says, hey, I saw this thing. I just see you. This is not a real command, flurb-export. This is actually a picture from the blog post, so totally fake. But I can see you ran the command flurb-export on accounting server 01. This is a sensitive command, so please acknowledge by typing acknowledge. Cool. Some problems with that if we just stopped there and typed acknowledge. If somebody hacks a Slack account, somebody steals your credentials and delete the message, or they type the word acknowledge, no big deal. So what we actually do is when we send these directly to individuals, they get a duo push, right? And they have to act that. And I'm not saying that it's foolproof, but I mean that's pretty good because you have an out-of-band way to acknowledge alerts now. So I think that's super handy. By the way, we don't send all alerts to individuals because there might be that hypothetical malicious insider case. So a lot of the alerts are, or some of the alerts are higher severity. But the reason we do this is because we can now watch more things than we would watch if it was just us looking at the board, right? If we're looking at the board, we're going to tune it down. But now we can say, hey, the operators might run this command occasionally, but it's pretty rare that they run it. What if we just ask them every time they run it? And by the way, we don't block the command. Like we don't say like, we don't prevent execution on it. But it's still going to be better than responding to this 6 months later to respond to it 5 minutes later. So that's kind of the idea. The other important bit here is don't overwhelm everyone. So imagine that you have accounting server 01 through 01000, and somebody does the same flurb-export on all 1000. Security bot's going to send them a lot of messages. So you want to be mindful of how many messages you're sending out. It's really important to not overwhelm everyone. And the other bit here that's important with security bot is we kind of have an internal team SLA that these alerts should get to the person within a minute of them doing whatever triggered the alert, right? If I do something that triggers an alert and the bot finds it and then 2 hours later sends them something and they've had lunch, they're just gonna be like, sure, I probably did that, who knows? If you send it really quickly, that's useful because they just did whatever the thing was. So verification is important too. Anyone in the room use Carbon Black? Okay, so Carbon Black is pretty cool software. And this is not a dig on Carbon Black at all. It's an interesting story. A friend of mine works for a company that's not in security, uses Carbon Black, and we were talking about their first red team exercise. And I was like, oh, how'd it go? He's like, oh, I mean, they just, first exercise, I mean, they got everything. And I was like, oh, well, what tools did you have? Did you have any indications? He's like, well, we had Carbon Black installed everywhere. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. Did you go back and find the alert? And what sort of led to the initial contact? He's like, no, they turned it off. So here's the important bit, is that you really need canaries. You need to know that your alerts are going all the way through the system and from every host. Because if you don't detect that Carbon Black has just been turned off on your servers, then I just turn off Carbon Black on your servers. And so canaries are super important. And one of the things that you can do here is generate events that you expect to see on the other side, and then look for them on the other side via alerts. And one other cool thing you can do is notice when boxes are launched in an environment that are not reporting to you. So in AWS, you have this AWS API that can tell you every instance that's running within your environment. And if a box pops up but never says anything to you via these canaries you expect to see, then it's probably not doing something you want it to be doing. Or maybe someone launched it accidentally. But you now know that boxes are or are not reporting to you. It's really useful. Red team exercises are something everyone should do. I think at least start with a tabletop red team and go from there. But this is how you improve all this stuff, right? So this is not like a static set of rules. You need to evolve it. You need to adapt it. Red team exercises are a great way to do that. Bonus. Weird to call this a bonus, I guess, but what if they got in anyway? So breaches happen, and that sucks. But if you're shipping all this data off host, yeah, it's a lot of data, but you have a ton of forensic data, and you can go back and look at that, and that is super, super useful. If you're trying to respond to an incident and you're just DDing the disk on a box and looking at it, there's a good chance you'll find useful stuff there. But if you're sending all the stuff that you potentially care about, there's a much better chance that it's just sitting there. Also, you can rent some computers temporarily, which is really cool. So in AWS, you can do something like launch 100 instances, pull all of your old logs out, make a brand new Elasticsearch cluster for an hour and look at everything that pertains to whatever this incident is. In fact, I mean, depending on what your limits are on AWS launching, you could just launch as many instances as it takes to put all of your log data online, and you can probably do that in an hour or two, right? That's super useful because then when you're done, you just turn them off. That's really hard to do in a data center. It's not very cost effective. So I think I kind of flew through this a bit, but here's the summary. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. So anyone that wants to raise their hand with a well, actually, okay, but I think that this is a good step forward, right? Like, you want to do these things, and don't just assume that like everything about this has to be perfect. Sure, there are ways to subvert this, but you're putting stuff out there that has a good chance of catching things, and the more of those you add on, the more little things you do, the better it gets. So don't assume your solution has to be perfect out of the gate. And log everything and look at your logs. I mean, I think that's basically, this is the TLDR. Log everything you can. It's cheap to do, you know, like it's really easy to send all this data. And, you know, 15 years ago, this would be a lot of data. Now it's not a lot of data in the grand scheme. So as promised, that's a shortened link to a GitHub gist, but that at the top will get you links to all the stuff I mentioned. The other note is Go Audit, like I said, is going to be released at O'Reilly Security next week. So we're actually going to, it's actually been in use in production for a year, but we're going to, what we were waiting on for release was actually having good documentation and examples so people don't just go, oh, that's a neat tool, star it, and then never look at it again. We're going to put stuff out there so that you can say, oh, this is how I would stand up the environment and start looking at this stuff. Yeah, so the question is, when you're capturing exec.ve, do you capture parameters to commands that you might not want to be in a log? We do, and that's part of why only 4 people have access to SecOps. So the number of people that can see those parameters in commands is very small. There's a trust thing there, right? Like we potentially, if somebody types a command that has a password on, on the command line, we can probably go look at that and figure it out. But I think that's an acceptable risk when it's not just a log that anyone in your company can search and look for. So we absolutely capture that. The other concern we had with sort of, I mean, we could sanitize that. We could potentially scrub this out. We could look for it. There are a lot of different ways to do things on the command line. And it would have been really difficult. It also potentially opens you up to something where if an attacker knows that you're scrubbing these, they might be able to hide something in there. So we just decided to just log everything and keep it, and then encrypt the backups and make sure you can't just pull them out of S3 and steal all the passwords, that kind of thing. Yeah, so the question is, does this mean the log collecting we do is separate from all the application logs? Yeah, absolutely. So in the rsyslog config, you can send to multiple different locations. The logs that we take in, like Go Audit, those don't get sent to the operational logging infrastructure, right? They only go to the SecOps infrastructure. Some logs we send to both, like I don't remember what they are offhand, but like there are certain types of logs where it's useful for both of us to have it. But absolutely, so one way you can do that as a detail of our syslog is you can just set up another another socket locally and just have that as the place to send logs. So like you can log to a different version of dev log locally on a host, and then that goes to a different place. Yeah, so we actually split that up. Does anyone else have a question? Going done. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.